Okay, now let's talk about the manor. This is our last section here, and when we look at the manor itself, we're talking about the castle plus all the land and all the people that are involved in the surrounding area that Emily has now got under her subjection. So when we look at the manor itself, it is the center of the medieval society. This is where all of the major things are happening. Most of the society is relegated to a very small parcel of land, a very small radius across the countryside. And so there's not a whole lot of trade that happens across Europe. And so for that reason, the towns begin to shrink and they get smaller and closer to the manor. They get closer to the castle. So that way, if an invader comes, you can have easy access and get there. Money is very rarely used. Instead of using coinage, now they're using barter. They are trading goods for goods or goods for services. So all the money that had been accumulated back in the Greek or Roman Empire is now been carried off and somebody else has that, or it's been buried and lost and forgotten about. So really, even if you had found a gold mine somewhere, it's not going to do you a whole lot of good because nobody puts any value on that type of commodity any longer. So what that did is it forced people to be self-sufficient and to live off the land. They had to find a way to survive, and oftentimes that survival was through the land, through farming and growing their crops. So what they would do is they would produce food, they'd build a home, and they hoped that enough of it was left over so that way they might be able to trade with somebody else. If not, they just make their own clothing and go back and do it all again. And as long as they had enough to survive, that's all they needed. There was not a whole lot of saving or storing up. You did whatever you could just to make sure to make it to tomorrow. So when we look at a description of the manor, oftentimes you would find these near a stream or a crossroad because these are where the traffic would come through if there was any traffic. You would have easy navigation there across one of those. Even with some of the farmers, they would use the stream to help water their livestock. They use the stream also for irrigation of crops, if possible. There were two buildings that dominated the landscape. So you've got the castle and the church. Those are the two main ones that you would see. In this particular photo, this one over here is the church, and this one up here is the Lord's Castle. The domain. This is the part of the manor, the part of the land that was always reserved for the Lord of the castle. Typically, it was around 30% of the entire land holding that he or she would have had. So in this case, Emily would have kept 1/3 of the land always for herself. Nobody else would have been allowed to touch it or have it. That was called the domain. Yeah.
Okay, so like you said, like the manor and the not the manor, the castle and the church were like dominant.
Yes.
So like, why would the church be like? I could get the castle, but like, why would the church be like so much more dominant?
Because the church is so big.
Yep. It would have been because of the fact that the church was so central to this part of history or this part of life that the people would have devoted any additional funds or efforts that they could have to building a elaborate church. The Catholic Church headquarters a lot of times would also donate money or funds or materials to help build a massive church so that it was easily recognizable.
Okay.
So,
But
it's a good question because it helps us to have a better insight into the stronghold that the Catholic Church had on the people.
yeah, look, are they still like? Can people like still read? I mean, still not read yet. So they're still relying on the church now.
There's not a whole lot of education going on here
Okay.
because it's primarily live off the land, live one more day, make sure I have enough food to get through today. We'll deal with tomorrow.
That's so depressing.
It is. It's really, really difficult. Because most of us, we could walk home and we could open up the pantry, we could see, well, there's something I could eat in there.
Usually it's just like
Yeah.
raisins or some dry noodles or something.
But it's still edible. It's still food. Okay.
You wanna eat like a peasant.
Yeah.
They're my favorite food.
So,
bro. Don't make fun of me.
Farmers originally started off with a two-field system, where let's just imagine here that let's take our seats, our classroom right here. Let's imagine that this is our field that we have that we're going to be planting, harvesting crops. Well, we figured out very quickly that if we planted the entire field full of wheat, then after a couple of years, it's going to absorb all the nutrients, and that field is going to be good for nothing. You cannot plant the same thing every single year. You got to rotate crops. So they went to a two-field system. So they take this entire classroom, they divide it in half. They plant this half over here this year with wheat. They leave this one fallow or unused. And so you're using 50% of your land for crops and 50% being unused, and then next year you'd flip.
Wait, what? Wouldn't you like do like all
They
of
haven't
it for one
discovered-
thing and then do a different crop the next year?
Not yet.
Or
That-
do like half and half of one crop and the other crop and then flip?
Well, that's more advanced farming technology and what they understood.
Wait.
How is
That's
it a
kinda
hard
weird,
concept?
Wait, re-explain what they did.
So
They didn't know
They
what
would take-
nutrients
they would take the entire field, split it in half. Half they'd plant crops, the other half they would do nothing to. Because that leaving the ground without any planting and disruption allows the nutrients to reabsorb back
So
in the
I
soil.
understand why they did that.
But then you got-
They didn't know that some
Well-
plants took nutrients and other plants
Yeah.
didn't. And then you
And I get
rotate
that.
and you
But then you got all your weeds and your grass that you gotta plow under next year. So
Yeah, but what do you think you're gonna do about
That's
it?
what
You're
peasants
gonna-
Of course, it's gonna be harder.
Chance,
Well,
that's
they
what
didn't
peasants
know.
are for.
Yeah.
Not everyone's a
Okay.
master farmer like you.
So-
Chance.
They
Chance,
didn't understand that
Chance,
some
Chance
left
farm.
I'm glad
It's
that
history, you can't change it.
I'm glad that you are identifying with their backwards technology, and obviously they could have been much more efficient. And you're not going to like the next one either.
I bet I'm not.
But this was a slight improvement. Okay. So they figured out, as Chance has pointed out, there were a lot of negatives to the two-field system. You had 50% of your land being unused. So then they said, well, that doesn't make a lot of sense. So now let's divide up into thirds. Let's do a three-field system
Gosh.
where instead of having 50% of our land unused, we'll divide it up into thirds. So we have 33% here, 33% in the middle, 33% over here. These two over here are going to have two different type of crops, crop A, crop B, and then the third parcel of land over here is going to be totally empty and unused for that year. And then, well, I'll tell you, then we're going to rotate, everyone's going to move over one. So instead of having 50% of your land unused, you only have 33% of
But
your
if
land
they,
unused. Yep.
if they realize that that works, that means that there's gonna be one space every year that is used twice in a row.
Right.
So if they can do that, then why didn't they just do like we do
Because they
today
have
and
crop A, crop B.
switch?
Because
back and forth every year?
because at some point, until more recent farming technology came out, at some point, even up to, I guess I don't have an exact year here, but even up to the more recent history, we still left land totally unused for a year.
But like, why can't we use some here twice in a row?
When that's
Because one of the fields would have to be used twice.
right. So they figured that they could, as long as they did different crops, then they could rotate it. And after 2 years being used, it had absorbed almost all the nutrients.
And then the next year it would be.
And then next year be empty. Now, they did not have all the nutrients, all the nitrogen, all the technology to be able to reapply that into the crops like we do. They were using just the natural seeds and the rain that was given to them. So, farming was much different than what it is today. Chance?
So they grew wheat, right?
Yes.
So did they get 2 harvests of that or just one?
I believe that they had 2 harvests because they had a spring and a fall.
Okay, good.
So,
Yeah.
Chance.
like, I don't know, it's very agricultural
Master farmer.
focused. Like in the town in which I live is very
Sure.
Love you, Chance. So everybody's always like, oh, you know, new
Guys,
farmer
dude, I have to
closet.
get
I was
6
like, what
barrels and 6
technology
flasks.
is there? And so this is kind of like, oh.
Yeah.
Like I didn't even realize that they didn't even realize.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's so weird.
Chance?
Never mind.
So,
This is stressful for
Yeah.
all of the country.
Yeah, I understand that. So,
Yeah.
if you were to live in this time and you were a normal person living life here,
I'm not normal.
the people typically would have fallen into one of these categories. We have the freemen. These are the people that either owned land or they could afford to rent land. And typically, most people fell into one of 3 categories. Either they were part of the clergy and they worked for the church, they were part of the nobility, or part of the peasantry. So these freemen here were sometimes nobility, maybe right below the rank of nobility, and they could either own the land or afford to rent the land independently. And they always had a skill or some sort of labor that they could provide in exchange for that land. So these would have to be men that could work, men that could had a good amount of endurance and strength. Now below them we had the serfs. These guys were generally between the level of slave and a freeman. This would have been Haley in our earlier situation, earlier example. Not quite a slave, but not free and independent on her own. This was the highest percentage of people in the Middle Ages. They would have fit into the serf category.
Would I be considered a freeman?
No, you still would have been considered a serf, but you would have been on the top and upper level of the serf.
Okay.
Yeah. So you typically would have a piece of land that was borrowed from the Lord, and as we talked about before, then you would work that land in exchange for being able to keep some of it. Now, you were bound to the land. You could not leave without permission from Emily.
Your land or like the land?
The land that you were granted by Emily, Haley had to stay there. She could not leave.
No wonder they didn't die too far away from where they were.
Well, so we're talking about pack up and move. We're talking about
Gotcha.
go get your own land, start a business in town, open a donut shop, that
So
type
she
of thing.
said no, then you can't even leave.
Correct. Because she has come to Emily begging for assistance, so she is indebted to Emily until Emily releases her of that indebtedness.
Like even if she pays her back like 2 folds or something like that.
How does she know I'm not poisoning the ground?
Yeah.
Whatever.
Is what?
It's just whatever.
Right. And Emily has the power and ability to change it anytime she wants to. She can say, I know we agreed to this, but I'm going to change it. And Haley could say, well, that's not fair. And Emily could just laugh.
Wow.
You are a terrible person.
So, that looks like 23. There's a dash in the middle of that, but because of the funny font that I've chosen to use, it looks like 23. So Haley was required to work Emily's domain for 2 to 3 days a week. 2 to 3, not 23. It's 2
There's not
to
even
3.
close to it.
There's a tiny little dash right there.
That's stupid.
What?
I can't see
I
it.
see
Yeah.
it. Like I see
Well,
Yeah.
look hard. Gee.
That's why I wanted to be sure to clarify that for you.
There's a dash on here.
And so you were bound to the land. You had to work for 2 to 3 days to help work Emily's land. That way it would ensure that Emily could sit at home and just enjoy her Netflix and would not have to get out and actually work her land. Remember, that's 30%. She's keeping 30% of that land to herself.
Is it Emily's land, my land? Because
Well, no, this is the domain.
I have her land.
You have one of the pieces of that 60% that she gave away to other people. Remember, the domain is hers that she kept without
It's that 30% that she didn't do.
Yeah.
letting anybody else on.
So if I work my land, aren't I technically working her land?
Well,
But
that's
you're
why I
not
said
working.
you have to work the domain. That's specifically her land. So for 2 to 3 days, you are out of commission. You cannot work on your own land. You got to work on her land, doing whatever she says, whether that's gardening, whether that's ripping up weeds, whether that's planting stuff, whatever she needs. Yep.
Wait, so why didn't she just rent it all out?
That's my question.
Because it depended on what she wanted to use that land for. If she wanted to use it to grow crops, then she gets to keep 100% of all of whatever Haley and her friends harvest and do on that domain. If she wants to make a beautiful landscape garden out of it, then she's gonna make sure that Haley does a good job with it. So it depends on what she wants to use it for.
Okay, I'm just saying, if I get that, but wouldn't it make more sense? And then she wouldn't have to worry about any of the land or anything like that, except for like what her castle.
But this is generally the land right around the castle, so she needs to feed some of her servants. So she needs to make sure that she has food. She wants to make it beautiful. She wants to.
She just use her income from everyone else who's renting her land.
She could.
She gets more,
Um,
she gets to keep 100% of whatever happens to the domain.
Right.
So, but she could just raise up the percentage from her dollars.
No, she doesn't want to. She wants
Well-
all
That's
of
not the
it.
way this works.
Yeah.
Stop arguing.
So, yeah, Chance.
I'm not
Perhaps.
worried about it. This is the way
I'm
it
sorry if I
is.
was talking
Chance,
to
I'm
you
not.
about
I'm not saying that you're wrong on this because they could have,
It's just the way it is.
but typically they would keep 30% that was specifically reserved just for her.
I wish we could
Okay.
go back in time and just talk to these people.
Now,
Explain something.
Haley had to pay for the land that you're living on. We've already talked about that to some extent. You had to pay rent, and generally that rent was in the form of
Here comes the angle.
the produce that you make. You got to give a percentage. And then at the bottom, we've got the slaves. Slaves get no say in much of anything.
Pretty much.
So these are the people that were not able to get an agreement with one of the lords to be able to get land, or they were so poor that or in bad health that they could not work the land to her satisfaction, or they got on the bad side of Emily and Emily took away their fief and now they were left to be slaves for somebody else. So that's a really bad place to be in this part of Europe. So for most people, their way of life was centered in this small section of land. Most of them never left home. Most of them were born, they lived and died within 20 miles, within a 20-mile radius. And so it was just not an option for them. Many people lived in a garden shed type of home. Some of you may have a garden shed out back. You may have a little tool shed of some sort. That would be similar to what most people lived in. A lot of them were just one room. Their entire family lived in there. No furniture, dirt floors. Would have been very common. If you lived in town, people in town may have lived in a two-story home with one open room on the upstairs, one open room on the downstairs, maybe a couple pieces of furniture, maybe a table, maybe a little bench, perhaps a small chair. That would have been it. They did celebrate holidays. So one of the holidays they celebrated was Christmas. Of course, being very Roman Catholic, they would have celebrated Christmas big time. They were generally given 2 weeks to celebrate Christmas from the Lord of the Castle. 2 6-day weeks, because of course the 7th day was the Sabbath, or was the church day, and so nobody did any work on Sunday. So you're given 2 6-day weeks of vacation, and many people counted that down because they were the 12 days leading up to Christmas.
Is that why we have almost 2 weeks off?
Hanukkah.
The 12 days of Christmas. Some of you just missed that entire reference.
I got you, Mr. Jones.
Okay.
I got a question.
I got you.
Yeah.
Is that why we have
Wait.
I don't think it has anything to do with that.
So were they back to work the day after Christmas, or was like Christmas like in the middle?
I don't know exactly how they did the timing of that, but
That's the Christmas.
the 12 Days of Christmas song can be traced back here to Middle Ages.
That is literally my favorite Christmas song.
There you go. They also celebrated Easter because it was, again, another religious holiday. I don't believe the Easter Bunny would have been involved in that.
What?
Mm-mm.
You're telling me the
My
Easter Bunny's
dad
not
is
real?
from-
Jelly beans. Why wouldn't you want that? What?
I know, like that.
I'm-
I know.
Justin is so strange.
No, he does in Hawk.
Julie?
This is like really random and probably also
Liddy, would you
around the country.
Not yet. We're about 500 years before then. Last thing here today. They were very much forced into hard work. They had good work ethic. Most of that was required, or you didn't survive. You would work from sunrise to sunset, and so they did not have time. They just as the sun came up, it was time to get up, get going to work. When the sun went down, it was time to leave the field, go home. Most of their family worked, including the children. Everybody got up and did whatever they could, and they were forced to go out and to labor in the fields or to work the domain. Sometimes as you had older children could go work the domain, so mom and dad could go work their land grant, their fief. It's characterized by a lot of poverty, a lot of misery. And because of all the things we've talked about in this section here, the lifespan was extremely short. I mentioned it was somewhere around 30 to 35 years old. So I would be considered an old man. And it was just a way of life. It was not something that was uncommon or looked at as strange. It was just acceptable that the man of the house would die around that age, whether it be in battle or whether it be due to the hardship of life. Many of the people that got to be in their 30s looked like they were in their 60s or 70s. And
That wasn't like all like the kings and like lords and stuff like that. Always like the pictures of being like looking old. Just because they like you basically like kind of
Did they have problems with depression?
it could be.
And like